Hello and welcome to a demonstration of how ViPR can automate VPLEX high availability volumes with RecoverPoint protection. In this demonstration, we'll show you how ViPR can automate the creation of VPLEX high availability volumes and also orchestrate the steps necessary to provide RecoverPoint protection for that volume. In this diagram, we have three data centers: Boston, New York, and Syracuse. Syracuse is acting as our DR site. Boston and New York have a VPLEX metro between them, and any volumes that ViPR creates will be exposed to both data centers. So our demonstration will show how ViPR can create a volume that is exposed to both Boston and New York using VPLEX metro, and also have CRR RecoverPoint protection from New York, which is the second leg of our VPLEX metro configuration, to our DR site in Syracuse. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to log in as the Emcworld user and take a look at some of the physical arrays and VPLEXs that we have in our demo configuration. And we do this by looking at the dashboard. Under the physical assets, we can click on the storage systems. We have three backing arrays that are all symmetrics, and we have two sets of VPLEX metro configurations. The first one would be our HA configuration that we're going to use, and then the second one we're just going to use one leg for VPLEX local for RP targets. So let's take a look at the VPLEX clusters that we have. This is the first cluster. This is the source. So as you can see, there's two clusters. We'll be creating volumes on both of those as part of the automation. And this is the second cluster, and although there are two clusters here, I'll only be using cluster 1 for the purpose of RecoverPoint remote volumes. So they're already connected to RecoverPoint. This is my RecoverPoint UI. We have three sites here. We're only going to be using two because we're going to be protecting from New York to Syracuse. And if we take a look at the protections that we have on the RecoverPoint appliance, I just wanted to try to keep things relatively clean so we don't have any consistency groups on there. This will allow us to see the consistency group appear as part of the orchestration. Going back into the ViPR UI, we have registered that RecoverPoint system. This is what it looks like right here, and ViPR does a pretty good job of showing you all of the storage systems, including the VPLEXs and the symmetrics arrays that are available for protection by virtue of that protection system. Now, one of the things we'd like to look at is some of the way that we configured the data centers to match the virtual arrays that are configured within ViPR. So if we take a look at the virtual arrays, you'll see that we have three. It'll match up with our diagram that we were looking at: Boston, New York, and Syracuse, which I marked with DR just so that we could remember throughout the course of the demo that that is the DR data center. And now that we have the virtual arrays configured, we can move on to creating virtual pools. The first virtual pool that we want to create is the virtual pool that we would create if we want any specific options, criteria, or attributes associated with the high availability target volume. Now, if we're going to be creating a high availability target volume in New York, it might be a good idea for us to create a virtual pool that associates all the attributes that we would want for a target volume in New York that's being used for high availability. So this would define the backing store that we would use. So that's the first one we're going to create. It doesn't really have any special attributes in this case, but it helps us drive through the demo a little bit more clearly. The second one we're creating is the Syracuse DR target pool. This is the pool that we are going to lock down as being in Syracuse and associate it with the RecoverPoint target volumes that we're going to create. Now, in this case, we have a VPLEX cluster in Syracuse, so we do want those target volumes to be VPLEX encapsulated or VPLEX local volumes. Now that we've defined our target pools, now we can define our source pool. Now this is the pool that we would actually use when we go to provision new volumes, and we're going to reference those two target pools that we just created within the attributes of this virtual pool. So we'll call it high availability block with protection, and this is the pool that we would provision volumes out of the Boston data center. We would provision them out of Boston with high availability to New York and protection to Syracuse. And you'll see how we do that here. In the high availability section, we'll choose VPLEX distributed because we want to distribute the volume from Boston to New York, so we mark that here, using the target pool that we defined just a few moments ago. And then in the protection panel, we can turn on RecoverPoint and add a copy of RecoverPoint, and we can choose the Syracuse virtual array for the target there, using the Syracuse DR target pool. And that's all there is to it for virtual pool configuration. Now you have one virtual pool which will provide high availability to the second data center and protection to the third data center. The next part of the demonstration is to create a volume using this source virtual pool, this high availability virtual pool of protection that we just created a moment ago, and take a look at some of the backing systems that we have, including RecoverPoint and VPLEX, to see what sort of orchestrations, what sort of steps it lays out, and what sort of artifacts it leaves as a result of the orchestration. So here we're going to create a volume. We're going to create it in Boston using the virtual pool we created, and we're going to call the volume Finance 1. I'm going to give it a size of 20 gigabytes. Now, while this block volume creation is moving along here, it's doing a lot of things in the background. It's creating volumes in the backing stores of the Symmetrics, it's creating virtual volumes on the VPLEX, and it's also creating protections on the RecoverPoint appliances. In fact, if we take a look at the RecoverPoint appliance here, you'll see that we went from 0 consistency groups to a consistency group that corresponds to that Finance 1 volume that we just created. Its production site is New York, and its target site is Syracuse, as you can see here. And that consistency group is initializing. When it's complete initializing, we know that we have our protected volume, our protected VPLEX virtual volume. And now that we know that this is complete, now we can fill in the gaps between, well, what happened between the request that we gave in ViPR to the time that the consistency group was created. The first thing we do is we can look at the source VPLEX Metro. And we look at the distributed storage, we can see in here that we now have a new consistency group corresponding to Finance 1. That consistency group is located on both clusters, so you know that it is a high availability volume. And the virtual volume that is created has backing store. By virtue of its label, we can see that it has backing store in Symmetrics, two Symmetrics arrays that are associated with each of the legs of the Metro. But if we look at the individual cluster here, this happens to be the New York cluster, you'll see that the journal volume that we created is only created on one cluster. It's a VPLEX local volume, and this is part of RecoverPoint best practices that are worked into the automation and orchestration of ViPR. So we will create journal volumes that are VPLEX local volumes as prescribed by RecoverPoint practices. If we take a look at the remote VPLEX cluster, or the RecoverPoint remote VPLEX cluster that we're using here, we look at the consistency groups that are in it. We'll see a corresponding consistency group to that Finance 1 volume that we created. But unlike the source VPLEX Metro, that volume is not going to be an HA volume. It is going to be a VPLEX local volume. And if you remember, when we created the vPool associated with the DR target, we did create a VPLEX local virtual pool for the RecoverPoint target. And as expected for the journal would be local as well, regardless of whether we created the target volume as an HA or a local volume. So that's part of the orchestrations that occurred in the background to be able to give you the HA volume with RP protection. And just to show that we can do additional things with that volume, there's a lot of things you can do. You can create RecoverPoint snapshots and so on. We're going to fail over. We're going to fail over that block volume, so we can choose the volume that we wish to fail over, and we can choose the target that we wish to fail over to. So when ViPR starts that operation, we can show the RecoverPoint UI to actually show the steps that are being performed in the background to facilitate a failover. So in this case, we had New York protecting to Syracuse. And as you can see here, RecoverPoint is now starting to digest some of the information that's coming down from ViPR, where ViPR is telling it that we want the direction of the replication to be reversed, and we want accessibility to the DR site, the RP target associated with that volume. So that's what you're seeing here, is that the personalities of the sources and targets are being switched. So now Syracuse is going to be the production and New York is going to be the target. And now that it's complete, we can go back to the ViPR UI and see that the failover job has been completed successfully. And this concludes the demonstration of ViPR's orchestration and automation of VPLEX high availability and RecoverPoint protection. Have a great day.